Okay, cool. All right. Hey, everybody. This is so exciting. It's our first guest speaker. He's virtual, but it's still a guest speaker. I've been trying all year to get someone in, and there's been a lot of roadblocks. So this is a big event for our Long Island history class. So let me introduce you. This is Dr. Velsor, and you, correct me if I'm wrong, you taught at Old Westbury, right, SUNY?
Yes.
Okay, so Dr. Velsor wrote a book. Did you write that book while you were at Old Westbury?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so it's a book about Long Island's role in the Underground Railroad. And I actually bought your book a few years ago, and I read it. I pulled it out this year since I'm teaching this course, and I said, well, why would I make a presentation based on the book when I can go right to the source and get the author? So this is really cool that you're here, and I'm very grateful that you took your time to be here. So I'm going to ask all of you, of course, to be respectful, keep your phones away, but also as an assignment, take out your notebooks and take some notes, because you've got the author of a book here. She's done a lot of research on this topic. So, we're really lucky to have her. Let's make use of it and take some notes. And I'll count this as a classwork assignment, okay? Nothing crazy, it's not going to be an essay, but just jot some things down, and then, we'll pop that in the grade book for the second quarter. Okay, Logan? I'll get you one, yeah. All right, any questions before we start? You guys ready?
Are there going to be questions at the end, or?
Yeah, we can leave a few minutes. I'll give you like a 5-minute notice when we have 5 minutes left, and then we can.
Welcome students. I can't see you, and I know you can see me. So you may have questions. If you jotted them down, maybe at the end we could answer them, or certainly if the class disappears and you still have a question, you can always reach out to me and I'll be glad to answer it. Is that fair?
They're a very quiet class, Dr. Velsor.
Don't you hate that? So today we're going to talk about some stories about the Underground Railroad on Long Island. But before we start, I want you to really take a close look at this picture, because this is a picture painted by Weber, W-E-B-B-E-R, and it hangs in the Cincinnati Art Museum. And Cincinnati is sort of a central player in the story, because these characters that you might see, there's a gentleman way in the back with a top hat on. His name is Levi Coffin. You may know his name, maybe you're familiar with him. His wife is down here in the front. Her name is Catherine Coffin, and she's helping an enslaved person. Obviously, it's a picture of the Underground Railroad and the friendly black dog in the front. Ooh, we love dogs. But this is important because this takes place in actually in the Carolinas, and both the Coffins are Quakers. And this is really what we're grounding our story around today. So I started this research way before you were born. And I worked with the Queens Historical Society, and we came up with, this is our first site that we found. It's the Jackson Homestead, which sits in what today we call Forest Hills. And this was a couple from Jackson. They were from Long Island, and they moved into Queens, and they joined the Quaker Meeting House in Flushing. And their house sat right on a pond. So if you go from LaGuardia Airport to Kennedy Airport, you go down that road, you look to your right, and you see a large pond. Today, it's just the pond, but when the railroad was there, it was actually a river. And at the LaGuardia Airport was a mill, and that was the Jackson Mill. So how do we know this story? It was an obituary that came out about Jarvis Jackson, which said that his granddaughter wasn't allowed to go down to the pond at night because there were runaways there looking for passage to safety. And those enslaved people went two directions. Some went to Connecticut, depending upon whether they were safe or not. And some of those enslaved people were taken to Jackson's Landing on Hempstead Bay, which is on the south shore, very close to Jones Beach. I'm sure some of you have been to Jones Beach. You can see this as you go down the highway. As you look, you can see through Oakfield Landing there. You can see coming down the road, to Wantagh, you can see this original village. mean, it's so if you were in Wantagh, you would go up right off the highway there, you would find this little house. And this is the Jackson house. The original house was here in the back, the smaller house, and that was their home. And they became, in 1655, Thomas and Mary Jackson decided they wanted to have a mill, a lumber mill, and they opened a lumber mill and they hired enslaved people to work there. And the community was called The Brush, is located on Twin Lakes Preserve in Wantagh. And this is kind of an interesting story personally for me, but as we started doing this research in the early 90s, Hempstead actually owned this cemetery and they never took care of it. And we made the TV got out there and hit the New York Times. And right now, today, if you go there, they've cleaned it all up. But the story, the little snippet in front of the burial ground simply says this: the AMEZ Church stood on these grounds in the 19th century. Interned here are U.S. Black troops from the Civil War, as well as descendants of slaves from the area known as the Brush on Oakfield Avenue in North Belmore. And this is a really interesting story of the Jackson family. They were there for generations. The enslaved people took the name Jackson, and the Jackson family were there. And this is a headstone that was uncovered. And if you do, this research was actually done by the Boy Scouts in Wantagh. And I was lucky enough to pick up the phone when a young lady called after seeing me in the New York Times and said, gee, I think you ought to come out and look at the story. And it's in the library in Wantagh. And it was compiled by the Boy Scouts when they were doing some development of the Levitt community in North Belmore. So that story is an important story because it also leads to our next story. As you may know, Quakers could only marry Quakers. So the Jackson family were one of the first Quaker families on the South Shore, and they intermarried and ended up moving to Jericho. Jericho is an important community, and I drew this little map up to help us ground the stories. Let's take a quick look. Here in the center, you see Valentine and Abigail Hicks House, which today is known as the Maine, as in the state, Maine Made Inn. And across the street on the left-hand side is Elias Hicks' house. And he was a Quaker minister that was responsible for the manumission of 75 enslaved people before the Civil War, which, you know, I'm sort of rushing the story here for you all, but by the 1850s, you have all these enslaved people who are now free because of the Quakers living in free communities. One is where you are right today. One was in Mastic, Shirley. The other one was in Westbury, and there was one in Glen Cove known as Guinea Town. So they were free Black communities that always existed next to Quaker communities. And you'll find that across the country. You'll find that in Cincinnati. You'll find that in the Carolinas. Every time there's a Quaker community, there's a free Black community right next door. And that's just because they freed their people and they gave them land and they gave them employment. Okay, so that's important because when people are running away, they're running to places where they can look like they're part of that Black community. I hope that makes sense. At any rate, so here we see in the center, we see Valentine Hicks' house. On the right-hand side, we see the Friends Meeting House. And across the street, up the hill there, today I call it the Jackson Malcolm House. It's also owned by Nassau County, and they refer to it as the Malcolm House, but it's really the Jackson Malcolm House. And way in the back, there is the mill house that we're going to see a picture of on Oyster Bay, which was part of the railroad. So let's see what's next. This is Elias Hicks' house, which still stands today. It was so what happened was, coming in a stagecoach right out of New York City, it was a one-day trip. So within the end of the day, they stayed overnight in Jericho. When it was too crowded to stay in the inn, they stayed in Elias Hicks' house. And this is the exact house that they stayed in. And in the library, they would stay. And Elias just left a jar for them to put some money in. And when they left money, he put all that money together and they built themselves the meeting house, which still stands today right there in Jericho. And here, he's actually buried there. Here, Valentine Hicks is in charge of this, what they refer to as this section of the Underground Railroad. And this section is different from other places in Long Island because this is Valentine Hicks. Valentine Hicks was the son-in-law, that's something for you to write down in your notebook, of Valentine Hicks. Is the son-in-law of Elias Hicks. Now, how can two people be married and have the same name? Okay, they're all Hickses. There were, just a short context here, there were three Hicks families that moved to Long Island. One was the Hicks nursery family, which is what Valentine Hicks is. The other one was Benjamin Hicks, which was Manhasset. And the third one was Elias Hicks. Yeah, another family from Rockaway. Long story. So this is a picture of Valentine, and he was the second president of the Long Island Railroad. But he lived in New York, and I think I'm going to go back one slide for you. There. He lived in New York, and he was a prosperous businessman working with his brother, and he came out to Long Island, and he built this house. He built an addition onto this house. The original house is the house on the right side, and he built the very elaborate house on the left side. And they were all connected. It was actually a very, very large house, and it was right across the street from Elias Hicks' house. This is a picture of the former Maid Inn. Unfortunately, it was purchased and made into a very large restaurant. And what happened was they destroyed the whole inside of it. I know, tears in my eyes. But anyways, we got to know the story way before they destroyed the house. So Valentine Hicks came there. He was a farmer. He had a wife named Abigail, and Abigail was an abolitionist by every sense of the word. She worked diligently to help enslaved people. She worked by giving them IDs. She worked by creating new certifications for them, manumission false papers, all that, all real good espionage kind of fun stuff. And what they would do is Valentine would get a message from the meeting house in New York City, and they would make arrangements for a group to come out to Jericho. And when they came to Jericho, they had to find places for them to live. And in the Maid Inn was the secret closet. And when I was doing my research, I learned about the closet before I learned about all the other stories. So when I did this, I was new at it and didn't know what I was going to find. So here we have, here up on the left-hand side, you'd go up the formal staircase inside the Maid Inn. And at the top of the stairs, there was this closet, which I would open. And I would say that I'm 5'4". And so the closet was at my waist. And what would happen is it looked like a linen closet. And what these people did, and this was Abigail, she had the carpenter. I don't know if you've ever done this, but let's just imagine. You took shoe boxes, let's say empty shoe boxes, and you stack them one on top of the other, right? Well, that's what they did with the shelves. They made the shelves into little boxes and stacked the boxes one on top of the other. So it looked like a linen closet. But behind all the boxes, the picture here on the right-hand side was the actual staircase. So up the staircase, the enslaved couple or group would go, maybe mom and dad and some children, maybe two couples, and they would go up here and stay. And I have a picture here of the side of the house above the master bedroom where they would stay. And they would stay there for a while. The story for Jericho is that they took people, they would stay for 6 months, maybe a year, because they needed to be, I'm going to use the word, indoctrinated into Northern ways of life. Before we leave this site, this is the barn. And this is a wagon that was used in other stores on Long Island, which was a false bottom wagon. So enslaved people would go in the bottom and sit at the bottom of the wagon. And then on the top, they put their produce or corn or whatever coming out of New York City to make it look like it was filled with vegetables rather than enslaved people. So in this connection here, is really cool, Mr. Fleming, because this is from North Carolina. Hay wagons with false bottoms were used by Quakers to transport runaways from New York City to Long Island. And it is green. And if you ever go down to North Carolina, you can see this. These two people were abolitionists in Jericho, and I'm going to try to speed through here, and this is where I get stuck. But they were both abolitionists. There was a lot of writing that they did. They were part of a group of people who worked in and around the Malcolm Jackson house. They also lived across the street in this particular house and helped to take runaways to Huntington. And this house here still stands in Huntington on West Neck Road. And there we go. And they helped enslaved people go out through Huntington. This is my favorite house, and this is why we've rushed here. Okay, so this is the Jackson Malcolm house. And in 1815, and that's the same year that Valentine Hicks came to Jericho, the Jackson family inherited from the same Jackson family from Wantagh, inherited this house and came to live in Jericho. Now, this house is directly across the street from Valentine Hicks' house, or the main Maid Inn. It's also across the street from the Jericho Meeting House. And this house sits on one of the highest points on the North Shore of Long Island. And here on the back of the house is the original house that the Jacksons purchased in 1815. So let's just think for a minute. Here it's 1815. We have enslaved people who are free on Long Island, right? 1815 is before people are free in New York, because that didn't happen until 1827. So we have a community of free people living in Westbury. We have some enslaved people. One, historically, we find it was like one enslaved person for every 5 white people, which tells us that most enslaved people on Long Island were separated from their families, which is another interesting part of this story. But as we focus into this particular house, what happened here was this was part of the group that would come out that Valentine asked to come out or invited to come out to Jericho. So they would stay here. Some would stay in the Jackson Malcolm house. Let me just say this. It's called the Malcolm house because when Phoebe Jackson finally married, she married Mr. Malcolm. And that was, oh gosh, that was the granddaughter. So that happened just about the turn of the century. And she died. When they died, Mr. Malcolm gave that house to Nassau County. And they gave the name Malcolm when it's really a Jackson house. So be as it may. So this is the original house in the back, and they made some improvements to the house. And what would happen is people would come out here and stay and for six months or more. And the upstairs, the 3rd floor of the house was used as a schoolhouse. So upstairs, and when you go to this house, because it's open in Nassau County and you can go there, you can ask to go there and knock on the door. And up on the 3rd floor, you'll see a really grand staircase going up to the attic. And in the attic, you'll see a regular floor and windows, but there's nothing along the ceiling or anything. There's this ladder in the middle of the schoolhouse. And when I first discovered this ladder, I did not know what it was for. And my husband said, oh, don't worry, it was for going up and see this little roof. There's a hole in the roof that you can go up and repair the roof, the slate tiles on the roof. And I said to myself, well, that's an interesting concept, but look at the ladder. The ladder is really worn out. And then I found out what the story is. The story is that ladder was used so that at night when the fugitives were taken to Oyster Bay, they could look out the top of the hatch and see and watch them go all the way down to Oyster Bay. So today when you go there, you'll see the trees and you can't see Oyster Bay from the top. But after the hurricane in 2015, it occurred to me that those trees weren't there. And that was all farmland. So yes, you could see from the hatch. And then I was working with a gentleman who was a Quaker and a direct descendant of Elias Hicks. His mother lived in the Maid Inn as a child, and she had documents that talked about Abigail's efforts and how she worked with enslaved people to give them new identities. And she knew the stories about how this house was used as a schoolhouse. And she knew that Rebecca was a teacher there. And she wrote down that they could see and watch um, the fugitives as they walked holding a match all the way to Oyster Bay. Oh my goodness, I was so excited. So if you take Route 106, and this is right across the street from SUNY Westbury, which seems so ridiculous. But anyways, so you get off that exit for the expressway that says Jericho Hicksville, and then you go north on Route 106. And you follow 106 down to um, 25A, and then you follow 25A down to the Mill Creek Road, and you take the Mill Creek Road down. At the end of the Mill Creek Road is this little house, and it's called the Mill House, and it has a little sign out in front because it's right next to Council Rock, where the early Quakers first met. And ironically, I actually know Mr. and Mrs. Benson who live in this house. And they told me the story too. They documented it. So inside that house, it was at the time before the Bensons owned it. It was part of the Townsend family's home, and it was used as a building where there were sheep in the bottom of the house and the house on the top. And so when you came into the house, there was a room to your right where those windows are, and they had a little china closet. And you opened the china closet, and there was a long, and still there, long hallway to the back of the building. So the enslaved people would hide there until passage could be made across Long Island Sound. And this is a picture of Long Island Sound and what it looked like. And it was George Townsend who lived in Oyster Bay and who was a member of the Jericho Meeting House that would offer people safety across New York, Long Island Sound. And here's, it's 11:39. So this is our little connection here to North Carolina. In 1834, Miles White, and how do I know this? I went down there, I had a grant, I found this letter down in North Carolina, and the gentleman at the library handed it to me, and this was my moment of, yes, it really did happen. So this letter is down in North Carolina, and it's about people wanting to come up here to Jericho for safety. And so the letter simply says, the arrangements for a group of people of color under our care, I ascertained that some friends at Jericho, Long Island, were willing to receive and provide for a few families. A request came in 1835 from David White of Greensboro, North Carolina, to Thomas Willis of Jericho, asking for placement for 27 people. Valentine was very scared because it was a very bad time for people, Black people, to be in Long Island. They were not safe. So they come up to Long Island, and what happens? They have to separate them out. They have to make smaller groups. I don't know if you've ever been to Bethpage Village, but the Powell House actually the entire village was the Powell's farm in Bethpage, and some were taken to the Powell House. And this is a picture of the Powell House that now stands in as part of the Bethpage Village. This is all Quaker, and the Quakers are the ones who assembled all those houses in Bethpage Village. Okay, so the first step of the convoy was then made across Long Island Sound, again from Jericho as they separated. Actually, so most of that group ended up in Michigan up through that connection. Just amazing connections the Quakers had. Did we ever have a chance to talk about Henry Highland Garnett, Mr. Fleming?
No, we didn't.
How much time do we have? Anything?
We've got maybe like 13, 14 minutes till
Okay.
death.
So Henry Highland Garnett was an enslaved person. He lived in Maryland. He, great story, Thomas Trustee family. So his dad and his mom were called Trustee, and his dad was a shoemaker, and I think his name was Trustee because he was allowed to wear shoes because they trusted he would not run away. As a young boy, he escaped from slavery and with the help of Thomas Garrett, and they traveled from New Market Square, Maryland to Wilmington, Delaware, then to Centerville, Pennsylvania, and then to New York City. Here's New York, a picture of New York, of Maryland and the slave market. It still stands. I went down there, had a grant, went down there and took these pictures and put the story together. So Henry's family was indentured to a family in New Market Square. He was indentured because that gave them safety in a not free place of Maryland. But his master died, and they were afraid that they were going to be sold. And so when I went down there, what I found was in the Fredericktown Herald, posted in 1824, an ad that says here about that talks about looking Negroes are going to be sold. So what happens is Mr. Trustee wants to leave. And the story goes that, and here's another picture, girls for sale. That would have been his sister, 18 years old, another one, 22 years old, a good shoemaker, same year, 1824. So the story goes that they asked their master if they could go to a funeral in Baltimore, and he said, yes, you can borrow the wagon. Well, you know what happens when you take the wagon, they never returned. So this is the map that I drew up. It would be where New Market Square is in Maryland, and they took it all the way up to Wilmington and then across the river over to Philadelphia and ended up in and I know this from reading some diaries and also, again, a connection. The Valentine's notes were about Henry coming to, and Thomas Willis coming to Jericho. So this is the Buckingham Friends School that Henry went to, still standing. It was the first school in 1794, and the charter allowed enslaved and not free and not free Black children to attend. And up here, it's a long story, but I found this church that has a monument out in front that talks about the enslaved people. And this is where Henry had stayed with his family. And he stayed with the Warrens family. And his family was actually split up just like they were in Jericho. But here's a little note on that church that says pioneers at the turn of the century would make their way up the hill at night carrying lanterns to regular camp meetings. Before the Civil War, Bucks County was a hideout for slaves in Little Mount Gilead caves and the cellars of old farmhouses. So what happens is Henry and his moves to New York City because his father doesn't think that they're going to be safe in Pennsylvania. So the story gets kind of fun here because Henry actually attends there are 5 free Black schools in New York City that were built. And Valentine Hicks was part of that and helped build those schools through the Manumission Society. And he's a sort of a rebel. But anyways, he goes to school, he graduates, he gets a degree, and he learns how to be a navigator on a boat. And he comes back with some money in his pocket and to New York City to see his parents. And he comes in, and the whole house has been ransacked. And a slave catcher has come up from Maryland to catch his father. He knocks on the door and he says, hello, is Mr. Trustee here? And they had changed their name to Garnett. And he said, no, I'll go get Mr. Trustee. At which point he turned around and jumped out the window, just missing the family dog. I like that part of the story. And what happened was when Henry came back, he was outraged and he bought a knife and he was walking up and down the streets of New York City looking for the slave catcher. And he was taken by a group of friends, quote unquote, to Jericho, Long Island, where he lived with Thomas Willis for about 2 weeks. And from there, arrangements were made with John Ketchum, who we saw a picture of earlier. Henriette Highland Garnett met Captain Ebenezer Smith from Smithtown. And from Jericho, he was taken by wagon at night to Smithtown. And one of the fun things about the story about Henry is that he was like 6 feet tall. And people at that time, that was very tall for people to be. So Valentine wrote in his notes that they had to transport him at night because he was too tall to fit in the wagon, and they had to scooch him down, which I think is really kind of cute. Those are kind of fun things about history, which sometimes never get it written into the history books. But he lived there in Smithtown, which is, that building still standing as part of the historical site in Smithtown on Route 25A. And Captain Ebenezer Smith taught him how to read and sent him off to college. But he was hurt in a lumberyard accident and consequently had his leg amputated later in his life. But he was the first enslaved person to speak to Abraham Lincoln and the House of Representatives. And he was taken to Long Island, and he's part of our story. So he's really somebody to read up more about, because he's kind of lost in history. He's a contemporary with Frederick Douglass. And we run out of time?
We have 2 minutes until questions.
Okay, this is Westbury. This is right off the expressway. I don't know if you've ever been to Westbury on Post Road, but here, you know, Amy Post, right? Mary Robin, Amy Post, the abolitionist up in Rochester. These are in-laws, and this is her house on Long Island on Post Road. Frederick Douglass actually came and stayed here and wrote the letters on the internet. Here's a picture of her. I know she was prettier than this, but a lot of these stories were written, and that's how I got to know about the Westbury connection. Westbury is sort of a different place. It wasn't like Jericho. There were people that just came. They just carried notes of introduction to Westbury, and they would come stay overnight, and then they would find passage. Here are some notes. I can't read them all, but maybe you can read. That I found that these were the identifications that they were having. And one of the people who came up from West Virginia stayed. Aaron stayed there, and he wrote some notes down, and he's like a really interesting character. But here's the old place, and this is the picture of the old place. Here we go. That's what it looks like on Wheatley Road, and this is the original house, which we actually saved. It was going to be torn down, and I had just finished doing some research and had just published something, and wow, it saved the house. So this particular house was used in Westbury. It's more like a condominium. There are 3 different houses that are connected, and there were hollow places between each of the houses. So the story goes that there's a small room next to the chimney where the slaves would spend the night. And this was, the original house was built in 1695. And there it goes. That's the old place. And there's pictures. These pictures are all housed in the Historical Society there in Nassau County. And then they'd take them down to Hempstead Harbor to the Roslyn Mill. And here's a picture of, here's another wonderful connection. There's so many wonderful connections. Maybe you know Lucretia Coffin Mott. Maybe you've heard that name. But Lucretia Coffin, yes, related to Levi Coffin, they're distant cousins. She was from Nantucket. She went to school in Quaker Hill, and she married her English teacher, John Mott, and they had a home on the other side in Westchester County, which was part of the whole thing. So these are all wonderful connections. Yep. Yep. So, questions?
Yeah, Dan has a question. Sure, go ahead, Dan.
How long was the Underground Railroad used for?
How long was it used?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, at least up to the Civil War, don't you think? I've made it to the 1858s, right? That letter that I had from the Post family. Those letters were written to the Post family, were all housed up at the University of Rochester, where the Post family wrote letters from Long Island to Amy and her husband who lived up in Rochester. And when all was said and done, those letters are now part of the archives up at the University of Rochester. So when you're a young history student at the U of R, you can go up there. You can go read them. They're all up there. It's a wonderful source. Other questions?
Anybody else?
Go ahead. Ask.
We have one back here. Go ahead. Nice and loud.
Like, how would one dare to like keep slaves in their home? Because I understand that it would obviously arouse suspicion if you were buying large quantities of supplies. So how would one like get into the like process of or get into the inside like circle of Quaker abolitionists?
Very good question. Very good question. So let's just take Jericho, for example. If you were a member of the meeting house in Jericho, it didn't mean that you were an abolitionist. Okay. An abolitionist is somebody who actually takes action, right? An anti-slavery person could be somebody, oh, I'm against it, but I'm really not going to do anything about it. So you're talking about somebody who would actually take in an enslaved person and let them stay with them. So what they did was they would only take one. So it looked like they belonged there. But the trick that is really important to tell you is that what Valentine was very persistent on talking about in his notes is that enslaved people from the South would come up to the North and they behaved in a very different manner because they had been enslaved their entire lives. They didn't know how to look at a person straight in the face, for example. So you can't meld in as a Northern Black if you can't look somebody in the face. And even Harriet Tubman talks to her parents about that. You got to act like you live North. So you have to speak like a Northerner. You have to walk like a Northerner. So those were the social graces that they were taught in the school. More than just reading and writing was acting on how to act like a Northern Black person so that you would look like you belonged. And that was the most dangerous part. And yes, not everybody in Jericho was a participant, so it had to be quiet within it. There are stories about people in Westbury telling other Quakers on who was being involved. You know, they were not all good. And I would be misrepresenting the truth to tell you that they were all, part of it. There were only some that participated. And historically, you probably know this from your research, but it ends up that the Quakers actually split. Those who followed Elias Hicks were called Hicksites, and those who didn't were not Hicksites. So it was the Hicksite Quakers that were the abolitionists. And you'll see that in Westbury that they actually have 2 meeting houses.
Dr. Velsor, the bell is going to ring any second, so I just wanted to make sure that we thanked you before the bell goes off, because that was really a real treat for my students, and I just wanted to thank you for doing this.
Well,
So
make sure any questions you have. Thank you.
thank you for all that research that you've done and for sharing it with us. That was fantastic. I wish we had more time. Yeah, we didn't even talk about the fugitive slave law, right? So that made it even more dangerous. Now
Yeah.
it's a crime. Now it's breaking the federal law if you're housing.
Yeah. I like this, obviously. And I really think that the railroad is a miracle, a miracle of service. It's a good idea. At any rate.
Thank you very much.
I'll take it now or next week. Either way.
I don't know. I can pick it up.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt her.
I try to look at other people's work. I couldn't pick up with them. I just took it up my book.
That's all right. You're good. You too, Gary. Thanks.
I wanted to ask if I could do extra credit. Grade up. Oh.
Yeah, absolutely.
Colin
Sure.
Smith,
My grades are
Principal
due next week,
Attendance,
so.
Sean John Rathman, Erica Price,
Okay.
Gabrielle Cook, Alyssa Marine,
Go on
Stephen
school,
McGarry,
and
Gavin
you'll see it
Mantel,
says extra credit.
and Michaela Regan, Principal to Attendance.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And you get three choices. It's like three options.
Okay.
Or you can do all of them. It's up to you. Okay. Oh, boy, that was great. Can you see me now? Do you want to flip back to the?
I have no idea how to get back to you.
Hold on. Yeah.
Principal Darrow, please report.
That's all right. I guess you don't need to see me. We saw each other before. Unfortunately, I have to run because I have to go downstairs and teach an 8th grade class now.
Bless your heart. You have a great day and thank you so much. And any question or anything, just don't hesitate to ask. It's been a pleasure.
Sure. Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. You like the way I rigged that up? It kept falling. That was nice. That was a really good question that you asked.